We all love a good David and Goliath story, right? Underdogs speaking truth to power, taking on the giants.
Yeah, those stories are always so compelling.
It's that world of whistleblowers we're diving into today.
Definitely a fascinating world.
But we're not just here for the exciting headlines. This deep dive is about understanding what these cases teach us.
That's right. It's not just the stories themselves, it's what we can learn from them.
What went wrong in these organizations, and what can we all learn from their mistakes? Even, you listening right now.
Exactly. We want to make it relevant for everyone.
And today we've got three specific cases in our sights: Enron, Wells Fargo, and the whole Facebook Cambridge Analytica situation.
Three very different cases, each revealing different problems.
But I'm guessing there are some surprising connections between them too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get into those connections. But first, before we jump into all the drama,
Yeah, good point.
let's define what exactly makes someone a whistleblower.
Right, because it's not just someone who's, complaining about the office coffee.
Definitely not.
So help us unpack this. What's the difference between a whistleblower and just like a disgruntled employee?
A whistleblower is someone with inside knowledge.
Okay,
Could be an employee, a contractor, maybe even a supplier.
got it.
And they report serious wrongdoing happening within their organization. This isn't about airing grievances.
Right.
They're exposing a real problem.
Okay, so it's got to be something big.
Yes, serious stuff. We're talking fraud, safety violations, environmental damage, anything unethical or illegal.
Got it. So let's start with a case I think a lot of people are at least somewhat familiar with: Enron. This was a massive energy giant, and its collapse, it was shocking.
Absolutely, one of the biggest corporate scandals in history.
And accounting fraud was at the heart of it all, right?
Exactly. And what's so interesting about this case is the whistleblower, Sharon Watkins.
Okay.
She was an Enron executive herself.
Whoa, so she wasn't some low-level employee.
No, she was part of the system and still chose to speak up.
That's wild. What would make someone in her position, someone who seemingly benefited from the system, decide to risk it all?
Well, she first reported her concerns internally, tried to go through the proper channels,
Makes sense.
which is something organizations really need to consider.
You mean having those internal reporting channels?
Exactly. Having clear, accessible ways for people to report wrongdoing internally.
And, of course, without fear of retaliation.
Of course, that's key.
So are you saying if those channels had worked better, maybe Enron could have avoided complete collapse?
It's impossible to say for sure, but Watkins's whistleblowing did ultimately expose the truth.
And it obviously had a huge impact. Far beyond just Enron, right?
Right. It had a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Think about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act.
SOX. Oh, yeah. That came about as a direct result of this scandal, didn't it?
It did. SOX was born from the ashes of Enron.
I remember learning about SOX in school, but honestly, I didn't fully grasp its significance back then. So could you break it down for us?
Sure. SOX was a massive overhaul of corporate accounting rules,
Okay.
aiming to prevent future Enrons by increasing oversight,
Makes sense.
requiring more transparency and strengthening auditor independence.
Right. But did it really work? Did it create a true culture shift, or did it just add more paperwork?
That's a good question, and one that's still debated today.
It does make you wonder if laws alone are enough to prevent these kinds of scandals.
It's a crucial question we'll be exploring as we examine the other cases as well. Now, shifting gears a bit,
Okay, sounds good.
let's move on to Wells Fargo and the infamous fake accounts scandal.
Okay, Wells Fargo. This one really blew my mind. Millions of fake accounts.
Yillians.
How does that even happen?
It's almost too crazy to believe in.
Seriously, it's wild. What was going on behind the scenes?
Well, this wasn't just one bad apple.
Okay.
It was systemic, a problem rooted in a toxic work culture. Wells Fargo had these intense sales goals.
I've heard about that. Like crazy pressure to sell, sell, sell.
Exactly. And employees felt immense pressure to meet those goals.
Even if it meant doing unethical things.
Even then, that's the problem with a toxic culture. It can push people to make bad choices.
So it was pressure from the top that created this mess.
To a large extent, yes. The incentive structure was completely skewed.
I see.
And what's particularly disturbing about this case is that many of the whistleblowers were regular employees, not high-level execs.
Oh, wow.
And they faced serious retaliation for speaking up.
That's heartbreaking. They were just trying to do the right thing and were punished for it.
It really highlights the risks that whistleblowers take.
Even when they're exposing something as serious as widespread fraud.
Absolutely. It makes you question whether the systems meant to protect them are actually working.
Yeah, that's a good point. But before we go too far down that road,
Okay.
let's turn our attention to a case that's incredibly relevant to all of us in today's digital world.
I know where you're going with this.
Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
Couldn't avoid it.
This one definitely hits close to home. Data privacy is a huge concern for everyone these days, especially after everything that came to light with Facebook. Or Meta, I guess they call themselves now.
Right, the name change doesn't erase the issues.
Where do we even begin with this one?
Well, the central figure here is Frances Haugen,
Okay.
a former Facebook employee turned whistleblower.
Right.
She had access to the inner workings of the company.
Oh, so she saw how the sausage was made, so to speak.
You could say that. And she saw how user data was being misused and manipulated.
It's a bit terrifying, honestly. We all knew Facebook collected data,
Right.
but the extent of it and how it was being used, it was a real wake-up call.
For a lot of people, it exposed this lack of transparency and control we have over our own data.
Yeah, it really raised serious questions about the ethical responsibilities of these tech giants.
Big questions that are still being grappled with today.
And in response, we saw regulations like GDPR in Europe and CCPA here in the US come into play.
Right, attempts to rein in some of these data practices.
But are those regulations really enough to protect us? I mean, Frances Haugen's revelations suggest that maybe they aren't.
That's a crucial question to consider. And it brings up another potentially empowering thought.
Okay, I'm interested.
Do we, as users, have more power to influence these companies than we realize?
Ooh, interesting.
Could we be driving change more than we think?
It's a thought-provoking question because, honestly, maybe we've become too complacent,
Maybe.
too willing to just accept whatever these tech companies throw at us.
It's easy to feel that way. But before we spiral into digital despair,
Good point.
let's step back and see what broader insights we can glean from all three of these cases.
Right, let's connect the dots.
They each highlight different challenges, but there are some common threads running through them.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about these common threads. What patterns are you seeing? What lessons can we learn from these whistleblowers and the systems they expose?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways for me is the importance of a truly ethical culture within organizations. It's not enough to just have policies and procedures in place.
Yeah, I can see that.
If the overall culture doesn't value and encourage ethical behavior, those policies are just words on paper.
Right, they're meaningless. It makes me think about that phrase, tone at the top. Leaders have to set the example, right?
Exactly. Employees take their cues from their leaders.
If leaders are cutting corners or looking the other way when something's wrong.
Or prioritizing profits over ethics, it sends a clear message that it's okay for everyone else to do the same.
So you could argue that a toxic culture, like what we saw at Wells Fargo, is a failure of leadership.
I think there's definitely a strong argument to be made there. And this leads to another crucial lesson.
Okay,
The need for clear, accessible, and safe reporting channels for whistleblowers.
that makes sense.
If people don't feel comfortable speaking up internally, they're more likely to go outside the organization.
Which can be much more damaging, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like what Sharon Watkins tried to do at Enron.
Right, she went to her boss first, but her concerns weren't taken seriously.
Exactly. So having a hotline or an online reporting system isn't enough.
Yeah.
You need to create a culture where people genuinely feel safe coming forward.
Knowing they won't be retaliated against?
Exactly. And speaking of retaliation, that's another key takeaway from these cases, particularly the Wells Fargo example.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Those employees who blew the whistle on the fake accounts, scandal.
Yeah,
They paid a heavy price for it.
really sad. It highlights the very real risks that whistleblowers face.
Absolutely. Makes you wonder if those protections we talk about are actually working. They should be celebrated, not punished.
I agree. They're the ones helping ensure organizations are held accountable. It all comes down to recognizing and valuing that vital role whistleblowers play. But it's not enough to just admire their courage. What concrete steps can organizations take, to create a culture that protects them?
Well, beyond those policies and procedures, training is essential. I don't just mean ticking a box with a yearly compliance module.
Right.
It needs to be ongoing, engaging training that equips employees to make ethical decisions.
To recognize red flags, feel empowered to speak up. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, make ethics part of the everyday conversation.
Not just an afterthought shoved in a corner. But isn't that a two-way street? The organization creates the space, but employees need to actually engage too.
It's a partnership for sure. Organizations need to create that safe space. show that they take concerns seriously.
And at the same time, employees need to use their voices.
Right. Knowing they're supported.
It sounds like a constant work in progress, building that culture.
It is. Communication is key. Willingness to learn and adapt, even when things go wrong.
You hit the nail on the head. We can learn so much from these cases.
The cautionary tales, really.
They show us what happens when those ethical guardrails fail.
Force us to ask tough questions about our own roles.
Our responsibilities, the systems we operate within. Okay, so we've talked about the organizational side, but what about the individual? What can the average person listening to this take away? Someone who's not a CEO or in charge of compliance.
That's a great question, because I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we all have a role to play in promoting ethical behavior, holding organizations accountable.
We're not powerless, even against these giant corporations. It's easy to feel like one person can't make a difference, but these whistleblowers proved that wrong.
They absolutely did. Each of them took a stand, spoke truth to power, and sparked change.
It is inspiring, but it also makes me wonder, are there things we're doing as individuals that contribute to the problem, even unintentionally? Are we complicit somehow?
It's an insightful question, one that deserves some careful thought. Are we too quick to dismiss whistleblowers, for example?
Or do we sometimes just choose convenience over ethics?
It's possible, like when we click agree on those terms and conditions without reading them.
Just to use the app.
Or buy a product from a company known for, questionable practices because it's cheaper.
Because it's on sale, it's a good deal.
Right. Are those seemingly small choices actually part of a bigger problem?
They could be.
It's all connected, isn't it?
Yeah, I see that. Our individual choices, the culture of the organizations, the systems that govern our society. So how do we break out of that cycle?
How do we become more conscious, more active participants in shaping a world where ethics matter?
That's the big question.
Well, for starters, raise awareness.
Okay.
Educate ourselves about the issues. Engage in thoughtful conversations and be willing to challenge the status quo.
Right, so instead of just accepting things as they are, we need to be asking questions like, what systems are in place in my workplace to encourage ethical behavior?
Exactly. What are my own company's policies on whistleblowing?
Good point. And it doesn't stop at work, right? Think about your community, your personal life.
Absolutely. Are there places where you see a need for greater transparency, accountability? What role can you play?
That's a powerful shift in perspective. It's not just about whistleblowers out there. It's about all of us.
Taking responsibility for creating a more ethical world.
It's not just about calling out wrongdoing. It's about actively building something better.
That's the heart of it.
This conversation has really given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
And I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. These whistleblower cases offer much more than just headlines.
They offer a glimpse into this complex interplay between our individual actions and those bigger systems.
Right. They challenge us to look at our own beliefs and behaviors, ask ourselves how we can contribute
to a more just and ethical society.
I think that's a great note to end on. But before we wrap up, I want to come back to something you said earlier
Okay.
about the power of the individual.
Yes, it's a theme that's come up a few times.
It has. So in this final segment, let's explore that idea a bit further. How can we harness that power to make a real difference? We've talked about those brave whistleblowers and the huge problems they brought to light. But I keep thinking about that idea of individual power. It's easy to feel kind of small, insignificant when you think about these giant companies and complex issues like data privacy. So how can we as individuals really make a difference?
That's the million-dollar question. It's easy to get overwhelmed and think, what can I possibly do? This is too big. But the truth is, we all have more power than we think.
It sounds cliche, but I really believe that. It's those small actions multiplied by millions of people. That's what creates change.
I agree. Look at those whistleblower cases. Even one person can spark a chain reaction. Think about Sharon Watkins at Enron. Just one person. But her decision led to, the downfall of this multi-billion-dollar company and a total overhaul of corporate accounting rules.
It's a reminder that even when we feel powerless, we're not. Our voices do matter.
Absolutely. And there are so many ways to use them. We can speak up, like those Wells Fargo employees did, when we see something wrong. But there are other things we can do too, less direct, but still important.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, we can support businesses that align with our values. Do some research before you buy. Look into a company's environmental practices, their labor policies, how they handle data.
So voting with our wallets, we all have that power every day.
Exactly. We can hold our elected officials accountable too, for creating laws that protect whistleblowers and promote ethical conduct.
Yeah, write to our representatives, participate in town halls, get involved in advocacy groups.
All good ways to make your voice heard.
But sometimes it's tough to know where to even start. It can feel overwhelming.
I get it. It's a journey. Just start small. Maybe it's being more mindful about what you buy as a consumer, or having a conversation with a friend about an ethical issue that matters to you.
Those conversations can be powerful, right?
They can raise awareness, spark ideas, create a sense of shared responsibility.
And don't forget about the power of example.
Mhm.
Living your values, speaking up, even in little ways, that can inspire others.
Like a ripple effect.
Exactly. And those ripples can become waves. This whole conversation has really changed how I think about things. I used to see whistleblowers as these, like, extraordinary people, almost superhuman in their courage.
Yeah.
But now I realize they're regular folks who chose to do something amazing.
That's what makes their stories so inspiring, right?
Mhm.
Shows us we all have the potential. We don't have to wait for someone else to fix things.
We can be the change we want to see. I love that. And to bring it back to our listeners, I think the key takeaway is we don't have to be whistleblowers in the traditional sense to make an impact. We can all be truth tellers, advocates, champions for a more ethical world.
I like that. And remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn, to grow, and to use your voice for good.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about this stuff.
And to our listeners, we hope this conversation has given you some things to think about. What systems are in place in your life, your workplace, your community that encourage ethical behavior? Are there places you can speak up, advocate for change, be a force for good?
Keep asking questions, keep learning, keep using your voice. We need more truth tellers.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.